Okay, this is a follow-up video to video 122, the prior video where I talked about inflation and ramifications for investors. This video, I just wanted to do a quick addendum where I talk about some books, basically three books that I recommend very, very strongly to read, just to give really like a broad and deep foundational understanding of different types of scenarios of inflation and different questions that can happen over time and historical scenarios. And also one of these books is actually fiction too, so which although sometimes the real truth happens in fiction. So anyway, we'll get into the titles. I'm just going to make a few comments about each one, and I'll have links to each of the books in the description below this video. Okay, so the first title is When Money Dies by Adam Ferguson. This is basically a history of the 1920s hyperinflation that hit Germany, Austria, and Hungary. And, I don't know what this coming inflation is going to look like. Almost certainly it won't look like that inflation then. That was probably the worst example and the most accelerated example of hyperinflation that we've ever had, certainly in the modern era. So I don't think what's coming, if we do end up having a long cycle of inflation, I don't think it's going to look like that. But the value in reading this book is to give you perspective on the absolute worst case scenario. And also to get you thinking about, if the worst case scenario comes, what might you do to protect yourself? And then the second thing that was very, very useful in this book was to watch the political playbook used by the various people in power to point fingers and to avoid taking responsibility for the hyperinflation that the governments literally brought on themselves, right? So, and what's super interesting about that, of course, everybody knows there's the saying, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes, right? And what we've seen with our president in the United States, our executive branch, is they are using, in a lot of ways, the same playbook that the German government did in the 1920s, basically pointing fingers at profiteers, at other countries, blaming greedy corporations, etc. And we're seeing the same playbook today. And so this book was helpful to kind of understand what the government does in order to evade blame. And as a result, this can impact certain investment sectors that you may want to know. If you know the playbook, you're going to know where kind of the ire is going to be pointed by both the government and people who believe the government, right? And so this can give you some context about where it might be more or less risky or dangerous from a political standpoint to invest because of the playbook that these governments often use. Nobody wants to say, yeah, it's my fault, I inflated the currency, right? So basically, this was one of the most sort of unexpected benefits of this book, but it's just a very good history of a worst case scenario for inflation, okay? So that's book one. Now, book number two is fiction, actually, and this is The Mandibles by Lionel Shriver. This is a book, it's about a family, an American family, that is wealthy, or has a wealthy grandfather, and the different descendants of this grandfather are living in different standards of living. Some are, one family is kind of wealthy and academic family. The husband's a professor, for example, and lives in Washington, D.C. and has a very good living. The other family members aren't doing quite as well. So you sort of have a distribution of socioeconomic success among this extended family. And you get to watch as a hyperinflation happens fictionally in the United States. And it takes place in the relatively near future. And what was interesting about this book was, first of all, a lot of very, I'd say very advanced discussion. This author obviously did her homework in terms of understanding a lot of the economic speak that you hear on TV, but also the way people use this economic speak to kind of bullshit their way through discussions of this topic. So this is sort of an interesting nuance that this author really, really nailed quite well. I would also say the other thing that was really helpful to me in this book was to see how different types of personalities are willing and able to see the truth, and other people are willfully blind to the truth. In other words, we had members, different characters of this book who they couldn't handle that the United States was kind of coming unglued or experiencing like a sort of a fourth turning, so to speak, a different kind of era of poorly run institutions and poorly functioning supply chains. And when you debase the money, you kind of debase everything, right? And there's sort of a spectrum of grasping this and then accepting it and then trying to deal with it. And if you can't grasp it, or if you can't even see the truth, you're really in trouble trying to deal with it and solve problems if you're going to be blind to what's really going on. So that was kind of, to me, very useful. It's sort of like you got to see the truth and you have to understand what's happening and then immediately get past that to try to strategize about how you're going to handle what's happening. And the members of this extended family who couldn't do that didn't make it. They weren't going to make it. So that was a major insight there. And this book kind of takes When Money Dies, the history of Germany, and it sort of applies it in some ways to a fictional United States in the relatively near future. So this book, you're not going to read it to have fun. It's not like a cheery book. It's actually somewhat depressing, but it's the kind of book that gives, basically, ironically, a lot of help to investors for this contextual backdrop of how to deal with inflation. All right, and then finally, this book, The Ethics of Money Production, this is actually quite a smart book, and actually somewhat more advanced on some level, where the author talks about different types of inflations that have happened and through history, and there's quite a bit of discussion of the history of money, monetary history, and different types of mechanisms used to impose inflation on a populace. Now, the actual central purpose of this book is actually it's an examination of the moral basis of inflation, and basically the author concludes that inflation is one of the great crimes and one of the great tyrannies of governments that can be done. And so there's sort of this ethical discussion that is maybe not necessarily directly relevant to this video and why we're reading it, but it's also quite interesting actually to think through the ethics of inflationary monetary policy. But specifically, there's just a lot of helpful monetary history where you learn different types of debasement, different types of mechanisms used to create inflation. And in the modern era, in a lot of ways, because of the way we have central banking arranged and the way we distribute fractional reserve banking through an economy, it's actually kind of, it's almost like it's difficult to point the finger precisely at who is doing the inflating, because the system has sort of been constructed with sort of a decentralized inflation that happens. And so that part was quite interesting to kind of get a deeper understanding of how banking impacts inflation, and also kind of the 20th century perfection of a set of inflationary mechanisms, containing a central bank, containing a government that spends more than it takes in, and containing a banking system that is sort of the distributed mechanism for putting this inflation into the system or onto people. And then basically it sort of consolidates power in the nation state, in the central government. And so you get kind of a mix of playbook, political plans, and mechanisms. And this book just really, really helps kind of articulate sort of the nature of the system, and it will deepen your understanding even further as a result. Okay, so those three books definitely recommend. And I guess there's another kind of bonus thing I want to offer, which is two books that are more about Bitcoin than they are about inflation. But these two books actually are also, they discuss inflation, and in particular in digital gold, there is a one of the early proponents of Bitcoin. His name was Wences Casares. He was from Argentina, and he talked about a period when he was a child. He would run with his mother down the grocery store shelves, and to make sure they would stay in front of the guy with the guy that had the price puncher, the thing that would change the prices. And they would just try and make sure they stayed ahead of that guy, because he was going down the aisle like raising the prices on all the items in the grocery store. And that was just a very trenchant example, because back then he was just a boy, and it sort of was seared into his mind a little bit. And it's one of the reasons he became a big fan of Bitcoin, and he got it right away, why this thing can be a tool to avoid inflation. And then, of course, Saifedean's book, the Bitcoin Standard, There's quite a bit of discussion of inflation, the fact that it's unethical, that it's a mechanism to basically extract wealth and extract time and labor value from people by the government's basically inflating away the value of the money that we choose to save, and also the various cultural ramifications that can happen from that. Basically, it causes people to shorten their time preference. If they know that their money won't have value in the future, collectively we behave in a different way. So these books are not about inflation per se, but they do touch on it. And I'm telling you, if you read these 5 books, you're going to be more conversant, both historically and mechanistically, and ethically, I guess, about inflation than almost everybody out there in terms of investing. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, a quick reading list on inflation, and as always, thanks for watching.